A Tiger tank could destroy a medium tank from over a mile away. So why did some nations build cheaper tanks to win the war? The War of Rapid Course doctrine was a philosophy of immense ambition that was aimed to replicate the success of German Blitzkrieg. The theoretical concept of this doctrine was advanced and aggressive. It was designed for fast breakthroughs, deep exploitation of enemy lines, and decisive encirclements. In practice, the doctrine's implementations were a chronic failure. Instead of the massed breakthroughs required, Italian tanks were often deployed in piecemeal. This disconnect between theory and reality, coupled with inadequate equipment and poor coordination, led to the rapid and decisive defeat of Italian armored forces. This doctrine was fundamentally unattainable, given Italy's industrial constraints, as the nation lacked the production capacity and raw materials. Italian forces were built around a concept that its own equipment could not support, due to many problems, including lack of radios and poor reliability. The Italian doctrine proved extremely vulnerable and was easily countered by its opponents. The widening technological gap meant Italian armor had no longevity against Allied advancements. The superior armor of the British Matilda and the reliability of the U.S. Sherman easily defeated the Italian forces. And number 6 is the Japanese doctrine of tanks for infantry support, based on a philosophy that is fundamentally different from its European counterparts. It was not designed for typical tank versus tank warfare, but primarily as mobile pillboxes to assist foot soldiers. It was a relic of World War I thinking, prioritizing close cooperation with infantry above all else. Originating from lessons in China, this doctrine was fundamentally non-innovative. Its effectiveness was highly conditional and terrain-dependent. It proved successful against poorly equipped Chinese and colonial troops. However, it failed completely against modern Soviet and Allied forces. While the doctrine enabled Japan's rapid early conquests in Asia, it proved to be a decisive liability in a prolonged industrial war that ultimately contributed to Japan's defeat. This doctrine was strategically unsustainable because Japan's industrial base could not support its requirements against major powers. Imperial Japanese Army did not have proper armored formations and technological innovations. This doctrine led to catastrophic inefficiency as the war progressed. Their decision to employ tanks in wasteful banzai attacks or as static pillboxes wasted Japan's limited resources. The enemy easily exploited the doctrine's glaring vulnerabilities. Due to thin armor and weak armament, the doctrine's effectiveness plummeted over time as Allied forces adapted. At number 5 is the French doctrine of methodical battle, and it presented a great paradox of the war. France operated tanks that were often technically superior to their German counterparts. However, the core idea was rigid due to centralized control. It was influenced by the static battles of the Great War. Tanks became infantry support and deployed in deliberate waves according to strict timetables. In practice, the doctrine was fatally ineffective. By dispersing tanks among infantry formations, they adhered to slow, methodical plans. The results were catastrophic. This doctrine was built on the assumption of a stable front line, and French forces were completely overwhelmed by the speed and tempo of Blitzkrieg. The doctrine's complexity and rigidity made it difficult to scale effectively. The French army was unable to form a sufficient number of tanks for massed exploitation. This doctrine resulted in a disastrous misallocation of national resources, including the Maginot Line and expensive tanks like the Char B1. The German Blitzkrieg was the perfect counter, as it was designed to exploit the very weaknesses of the French doctrine. At tactical levels, German commanders took advantage of the French tanks' weaknesses, such as lack of radios and reduced situational awareness. At number 4 is the British cruiser and infantry tanks doctrine. This philosophy was a logical attempt to assign specialized roles to armored forces. However, this very separation would create profound challenges. Heavy infantry tanks were slowly support infantry against fortified positions. Fast, lightly armored cruiser tanks were intended to exploit breakthroughs. The doctrine's effectiveness was mixed and highly situational. Infantry tanks were successful in defensive roles, while cruisers excelled in open terrain. However, both could be vulnerable outside their narrow doctrinal purposes. By separating the breakthrough and exploitation forces, the doctrine created inherent delays between battle phases, which prevented the British to achieve decisive, sweeping victories. The doctrine was proved difficult to sustain and scale due to its rigidity. Maintaining two parallel production lines created immense industrial and logistical complexity. It was also not cost-effective due to disproportionately high tank losses and a poor return on investment. The high attrition rate forced heavy reliance on American Lend-Lease tanks. The German forces quickly developed tactics to exploit the known weaknesses of two British tank types. But late in the war, British Army introduced the successful universal tank concept with the Comet and Centurion. At number 3 is the Americans' dual-role approach to armored warfare backed by industrial might. It was based on the mass production of Sherman tanks and tank destroyers. The M4 Sherman was intended as the primary breakthrough tank to support infantry and exploit gaps, while tank destroyers were envisioned as fast, mobile anti-tank units. In reality, U.S. Army successes came from superior combined arms approach, and the doctrine was often disregarded. For example, tank destroyers were frequently used as assault guns to support infantry units. The U.S. Army's true strength was the massive production of nearly 50,000 Shermans backed by a superior logistics system. This created a relentless force that the German military simply could not stop. The system was highly sustainable, prioritizing reliability over raw battlefield superiority. This allowed for the production of many tank variants and ensured high operational readiness. While two-branch system was logistically demanding, the doctrine was cost-effective compared to its German counterparts. Tanks and tank destroyers were built on simpler chassis, reducing production costs despite frequent misuses of the specialized vehicles. While German heavy tanks could counter individual Shermans, they could not defeat the entire system, and the American forces grew stronger over time. At number 2 is the early war German Blitzkrieg doctrine. This was not just a tank tactic, but a revolutionary philosophy of warfare built on the principles of speed, surprise, and combined arms. Championed by visionaries like Hans Guderian, it demanded deep integration of armored forces with motorized infantry, artillery, and close air support. This combined arms approach was enabled by a technological advantage in radio communications. The doctrine was devastatingly effective in the early war. Its core tactical approach was to create a Schwerpunkt, or focal point, to achieve local superiority and penetrate enemy lines. The results were the lightning conquests that redrew the map of Europe. The doctrine's operational efficiency led to massive encirclements, conquering millions of square kilometers and capturing millions of enemy soldiers in less than 3 years. The Blitzkrieg doctrine was ultimately unsustainable. It relied heavily on the initiative of experienced junior officers and NCOs, an asset that was impossible to replace as attrition mounted. While highly efficient in its initial phase, the doctrine's logistical vulnerability made it cost-ineffective in prolonged operations. The Soviets reacted with defense in depth and deep operations to counter armored spearheads. Critically, Allied and Soviet industrial superiority meant that conditions for successful blitzkrieg were no longer existed. And at number 1 is the Soviets' deep battle doctrine. It created an unstoppable tide that ultimately crushed the Wehrmacht. Pioneered by Marshal Tukhachevsky, it was aimed to attack the enemy's entire operational depth, not just their front line. It required multiple echelons on wide frontages to achieve true victories. The doctrine evolved from critical failure in 1941 and started an unstoppable juggernaut by 1943. This culminated in decisive victories like Operation Bagration that shattered German Army Group Center. The results were offensives on a scale never seen before. Deep battle broke Germans' entire war-making capacity with continuous operations hundreds of kilometers wide and deep. The doctrine was uniquely sustainable for the Soviet Union. It was designed for a massive conscript army, leveraging simple, robust tanks like the T-34. Deep battle was very effective despite an astronomical cost in human lives. Logistical challenges were immense, but Lend-Lease aid from the West, particularly the hundreds of thousands of trucks and radios that provided mobility and coordination. Once mastered and properly supplied, there was no effective counter to deep battle. Thank you for watching, and see you in our next videos.